The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse are one of the most enduring and mysterious symbols in religious and apocalyptic traditions. Their story originates in the Book of Revelation, the final book of the New Testament, which is often associated with prophecy about the end of the world. These four figures represent the unfolding of catastrophic events that will herald the final judgment, and their imagery has captivated the imagination of people for centuries. The horsemen are introduced in Revelation 6, verses 1 to 8, where the opening of the first four seals on the scroll of God's judgment summons these riders. Each rider is associated with a horse of a different color, each one symbolizing a particular aspect of the disaster that will befall the world. The first rider is often interpreted as the Antichrist, bringing false peace and a false sense of hope. The second represents war and conflict. The third symbolizes famine and scarcity. And the fourth, the most terrifying, brings death itself, sweeping across the earth with its unstoppable plague. Over the centuries, artists, writers, and philosophers have used the horsemen as symbols for various societal and political phenomena, representing both literal and metaphorical threats. The horsemen have been seen as embodiments of human suffering and destruction, often reflecting humanity's deepest fears about the future. But the Four Horsemen aren't just limited to religious texts or works of art. They are often invoked in modern-day discourse to describe the challenges humanity faces today, whether it's the looming threat of war, the environmental disasters caused by climate change, the instability of global food systems, or the growing pandemics. The horsemen seem to represent the inevitable struggles we face as a global community. As we move through the 21st century, with its advancements and challenges, many are left wondering, are we witnessing the rise of the Four Horsemen in our time? With each passing day, the urgency of addressing global issues like conflict, famine, and disease grows stronger. It is as though the four riders are galloping ever closer, their shadow falling on every aspect of our lives. In the Book of Revelation, the first of the Four Horsemen is described as a figure riding a white horse, often interpreted as the Antichrist. The symbolism of the white horse is striking because, on the surface, it seems to represent purity, hope, and victory. However, as we dive deeper into the meaning behind the image, we uncover the twisted irony that lies beneath this apparent innocence. The white horse, symbol of deception. The white horse itself is an enigma. At first glance, one might think of it as a positive symbol, associated with the triumph of good. In various cultures, white horses have historically been linked with nobility, heroism, and divine intervention. In Christian iconography, white is often a color that represents holiness and purity. However, in the context of the first horseman, this symbol takes on a much darker, more deceptive meaning. The Antichrist, depicted on this white horse, is not a conqueror of righteousness, but a deceiver, one who presents himself as a messianic figure, promising peace and prosperity to a weary world. He rides the white horse to appear as the bringer of salvation, a charismatic leader who seems to offer hope for a broken world. But his true nature is far more sinister. In Revelation 6 verse 2, it is written, "And I saw, and behold a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering, and to conquer." This passage introduces the rider as one who comes bearing a bow, an instrument of power and war, yet with no mention of arrows, suggesting that his power is not wielded through overt violence, but through subtle manipulation and influence. The crown indicates that he has gained authority, and his purpose is not peace, but conquest. The Antichrist's deceptive peace is central to his role as the first horseman. He is a master of illusion, an individual who can unite nations under a false banner, creating a facade of harmony while sowing the seeds of future destruction. His power is not in force alone, but in the ability to manipulate and control. He convinces people to follow him, not through violence, but through promises of prosperity, safety, and even spiritual redemption. The Antichrist's deceptive peace. The key to understanding the Antichrist's role as the first horseman lies in the nature of the peace he brings. Unlike the peace of Christ, which is characterized by justice, truth, and compassion, The peace of the Antichrist is a false peace, built on lies and manipulation. It is a peace that only appears to be real, but it is, in fact, a precursor to chaos and suffering. In many ways, this reflects the dangers of idealistic promises and the ease with which people can be swept up in the allure of a charismatic leader. Throughout history, we have seen leaders rise to power by offering simple solutions to complex problems, only to bring about more suffering and division in the end. The Antichrist's ability to manipulate the masses with his promises of peace and prosperity is a reflection of this recurring historical pattern. The false peace that the Antichrist promises is designed to appeal to the desires of humanity, to end wars, to bring about global unity, and to heal societal ills. But this peace comes at a terrible price. It demands the abandonment of truth, justice, and the moral compass that guides humanity toward righteousness. Under the guise of bringing people together, the Antichrist leads them down a path toward their own destruction. The bow, a weapon of subtlety. The bow carried by the Antichrist is an important part of his symbolism. Unlike other weapons, such as swords or spears, which suggest immediate and brutal violence, the bow is a weapon of distance and precision. It allows the wielder to strike from afar, hidden in the shadows, out of sight. This reflects the manner in which the Antichrist operates, not through direct confrontation, but through subtle influence and manipulation. The bow's use of arrows in warfare is symbolic of the Antichrist's ability to instigate conflict without ever having to be directly involved in it. He can sow discord and division by spreading lies, fueling resentment, and creating false ideologies that divide people from each other. In this way, the Antichrist's methods are far more insidious than those of other conquerors. He does not need to lead an army or march into battle. His influence spreads like a virus, infecting minds and hearts, turning people against each other in a subtle, unseen war. This subtlety is what makes the Antichrist such a dangerous figure. Unlike traditional conquerors who seek physical control, the Antichrist seeks to dominate people's hearts and minds. Through persuasive rhetoric, charismatic leadership, and false promises, he is able to manipulate entire populations. The bow he carries is a weapon of psychological warfare, striking fear and confusion into the hearts of people without them even realizing it. The crown, power and authority. The crown that the Antichrist wears is another symbol of his authority and rule. A crown is typically a symbol of kingship and dominion, signifying that the bearer has achieved the pinnacle of power. The fact that the Antichrist is depicted as wearing a crown indicates that he has not only gained the trust of the people, but has also secured control over them. This crown represents a reign that is built on lies and deception. The Antichrist's rule is not one of justice and righteousness, but one of manipulation and coercion. His power is not derived from legitimate authority, but from his ability to deceive and control. He is not a leader who governs through wisdom or moral clarity, but through cunning and deceit. His rule is not based on the will of the people, but on the manipulation of their desires and fears. The crown also signifies the Antichrist's ability to unite people under a single banner. Despite the fact that his rule is inherently divisive, he creates a false sense of unity by offering superficial solutions to deep-rooted problems, drawing people in with promises of security and peace. Yet, beneath this illusion of unity, there is a growing fracture. People are divided not by overt violence, but by the subtle divisions that the Antichrist's influence creates. The Antichrist and modern-day parallels. As we look at the world today, the image of the Antichrist on a white horse takes on new relevance. While we may not see a literal figure riding a horse, the deceptive peace he represents is all too familiar. The rise of populist leaders, the spread of fake news, the manipulation of public opinion. These are all modern-day manifestations of the spirit of the Antichrist. In today's world, it's easier than ever to manipulate people's perceptions. Through social media, politicians and influencers can spread lies, sow division, and create false narratives that appeal to people's worst instincts. The Antichrist's deceptive tactics of winning over hearts and minds without ever resorting to overt violence are being played out daily in our media and politics. The rise of globalism, with its promises of peace and unity, can also be seen as a manifestation of the Antichrist's influence. While the idea of a united world sounds appealing, it often comes at the expense of national sovereignty, individual freedoms, and the moral values that sustain society. The Antichrist's peace is not about true unity, but about the submission of the individual to a collective system that is governed by deceit and manipulation. As we look at the world today, it's clear that the spirit of the Antichrist is alive and well. We live in an age of division, misinformation, and disillusionment, where false promises of peace and prosperity are used to gain power and control. The Antichrist on a white horse is not just a figure from the past. He is a symbol of the forces that threaten to divide and destroy us today. To recognize these forces is to begin the fight against them, standing firm in our commitment to truth, justice, and the values that truly bring peace. The second horseman of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation is often understood as a symbol of war and conflict. This horseman, riding a fiery red horse, represents the inevitable eruption of violence and the destruction of peace that follows the Antichrist's deceptive promises. Unlike the first horseman, who gains power through manipulation and subtle influence, the second horseman brings about chaos through overt violence and bloodshed. He is a harbinger of the wars that ravage nations, the strife that tears apart societies, and the loss of the fragile peace that may have once existed. The red horse itself is a potent symbol of bloodshed and destruction. Red, in biblical terms, often represents sin, violence, and the shedding of blood. The fiery nature of the horse heightens this imagery, symbolizing the intense and consuming nature of the wars and conflicts that this horseman will bring. The red horse's fiery aspect suggests that these wars are not mere skirmishes or localized conflicts, but rather full-scale global catastrophes that spread like wildfire, consuming everything in their path. As the second horseman rides forth, the world is plunged into turmoil, and the once-held hope for peace begins to crumble. One of the most striking aspects of this horseman is the sword he carries. The sword is a traditional symbol of war and conflict, representing the violent force necessary to bring about death and destruction. In the hands of this horseman, the sword is not just a weapon, but a symbol of the destruction of all that is peaceful and harmonious. It is through violence and war that the second horseman seeks to achieve his goal of conquest, and the bloodshed he causes serves to further deepen the rift between nations and peoples. The passage from Revelation 6 verse 4 says, "And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword." This passage conveys the essence of the second horseman's power, the power to strip away peace and replace it with violence. It is important to note that the text specifically mentions the removal of peace from the earth. Peace, something so fragile and often taken for granted, is swept away by the second horseman's destructive influence. War, as symbolized by this horseman, is not simply about physical battles between armies. It encompasses a broader spectrum of conflict, including ideological wars, class struggles, and internal strife within nations. The red horseman represents the divisive forces that incite hatred and violence among people, dividing them along racial, political, or religious lines. These are the conflicts that often seem to spiral out of control, igniting passions and bringing about widespread suffering. In a world where divisions between groups grow ever wider, the red horse can be seen as a symbol of how easily those divisions can escalate into violent confrontations. The loss of peace that the second horseman brings is a loss that is felt on a personal level as well as a societal one. On an individual level, peace is often something people take for granted, only realizing its true value when it is gone. The violence unleashed by the second horseman does not only affect distant lands and foreign nations, but also impacts everyday lives. Families are torn apart, communities are shattered, and the sense of safety that many once felt is stripped away. The red horse serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and how quickly it can be taken from us. While the first horseman, riding a white horse, brought about deception and false promises, the second horseman is marked by the harsh realities of war. Where the first horseman worked through manipulation, the second operates through destruction. He brings with him the suffering that comes when the dream of peace is shattered. His presence in the world signifies the inevitable conflicts that arise when people begin to prioritize power, control, and resources over cooperation, understanding, and empathy. The loss of peace has a ripple effect that extends far beyond the battlefield. Economies collapse, societies disintegrate, and entire nations are left in ruins. War brings not only physical devastation but also psychological and emotional trauma that can last for generations. The scars of war are not limited to those who physically fought, but also to the civilians who were caught in the crossfire. Children grow up in a world shaped by violence, and communities struggle to rebuild after the devastation has passed. This cycle of war and loss of peace has been a tragic constant throughout human history. From the great world wars of the 20th century to the countless conflicts that have plagued regions across the globe, the pattern of war remains unchanged. Nations go to war over territory, resources, ideology, and power, and in the process, they sacrifice peace and the well-being of their people. The second horseman serves as a warning of this tragic cycle, a reminder that as long as the forces of division and hatred continue to thrive, war will always be just around the corner. The psychological toll of war is another important aspect of the second horseman's influence. As wars rage on, people's perceptions of the world begin to shift. The sense of security and trust in the future erodes, replaced by fear, suspicion, and a deep sense of helplessness. The horrors of war create an environment where people become desensitized to violence, and the human cost of conflict is no longer fully acknowledged. This is the world the second horseman creates, a world where war becomes a constant, where peace is an illusion, and where the true cost of conflict is no longer fully understood. In the modern world, the second horseman can be seen as a symbol of the continuing presence of conflict, whether on a global scale or in the form of civil unrest and internal struggles within nations. The rise of terrorism, the resurgence of nationalism, and the ongoing conflicts in regions such as the Middle East and Africa all serve as modern manifestations of the fiery red horseman. These conflicts are not always the result of traditional war between nations, but rather a complex web of ideological, political, and economic struggles that fuel violence and division. The sword of the second horseman is not just a weapon of physical destruction, but a symbol of the ways in which language, propaganda, and ideology can be used to incite violence. In today's world, political leaders, media outlets, and social influencers have the ability to wield words like swords, using rhetoric to inflame passions and push people toward violence. The Red Horse's power is not just about direct military conflict. It is about the ways in which people's perceptions are manipulated to create divisions and hatred that ultimately lead to violence. The loss of peace caused by the second horseman is not a temporary setback, but a long-term process that leaves deep scars on the fabric of society. It is a reminder of how fragile peace truly is, and how easily it can be lost in the face of greed, hatred, and the pursuit of power. As long as humanity remains divided and at odds with one another, the second horseman will continue to ride, bringing with him war and the inevitable loss of peace. In the face of this, the call for peace becomes ever more urgent. To break free from the influence of the second horseman, we must recognize the importance of unity, empathy, and understanding. Only through cooperation and a commitment to resolving conflicts without resorting to violence can we hope to protect the peace that remains and prevent the destructive forces of the red horse from consuming us all. The third horseman of the apocalypse, as depicted in the book of Revelation, is often seen as the embodiment of famine and scarcity. Riding a black horse, this horseman holds a pair of scales, an image that signifies the measurement of resources. The black horse is traditionally associated with the darkness of hunger, poverty, and the suffering caused by insufficient sustenance. The scales that the horseman carries represent the imbalance between abundance and scarcity, a stark reminder of the disparity that exists when resources are limited and the consequences of that imbalance on the lives of individuals and nations. Famine, represented by the third horseman, is a force that goes beyond mere food scarcity. It symbolizes the broader crises that can arise when economies collapse, agricultural systems fail, and supply chains break down. The image of the scales suggests that famine does not affect everyone equally. It is the poor and vulnerable who suffer the most. In a world where resources are often distributed unequally, the poor are left to starve, while the wealthy may continue to live in excess. The scales, thus, represent the judgment of the world's economic systems and the inherent injustice they often perpetuate. The biblical passage in Revelation 6 verses 5 to 6 states, "And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, 'Come and see.' And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, 'A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine.'" This passage paints a grim picture of the economic devastation that famine can bring. The reference to a measure of wheat for a penny and 3 measures of barley for a penny suggests that food becomes so scarce that it is no longer affordable for the common person. At the same time, the phrase, "hurt not the oil and the wine," hints at the disparity between essential sustenance and luxury goods. While the poor may starve, the wealthy still have access to their comforts. Famine is a force that has ravaged humanity throughout history, from the great famines of the past, such as the Irish potato famine of the 19th century, to the modern-day famines that plague regions of Africa and the Middle East. The consequences of food scarcity are devastating. Famine causes widespread suffering, death, and displacement. As people are forced to leave their homes in search of food, whole populations can be wiped out, and the survivors often endure a lifetime of trauma and hardship. The black horse, carrying with it the specter of famine, symbolizes this ongoing cycle of hunger and deprivation. One of the most tragic aspects of famine is that it is often man-made. Poor agricultural practices, political corruption, and the failure of governments to address food insecurity all contribute to the rise of famine. Climate change, too, is increasingly becoming a factor, as unpredictable weather patterns and extreme events, such as droughts and floods, disrupt food production. Famine is not just a natural disaster. It is the result of a complex interplay of social, political, and environmental factors. And while technological advancements have made it possible to produce more food than ever before, these innovations are often not accessible to those who need them most. The world's most impoverished populations continue to suffer from hunger, even as food waste remains a massive issue in wealthier nations. The scales that the third horseman carries also highlight the inequality that underpins famine. In times of crisis, the wealthier members of society are often able to hoard resources, while the poor are left to scramble for whatever is left. This disparity is amplified during periods of famine, where access to food is no longer a matter of choice but of survival. The scales are a reminder that when resources are scarce, the balance of power shifts, and those with more wealth and influence can maintain their position while others are left to perish. In modern times, famine is often linked to war and political instability. In conflict zones, food supplies are frequently cut off, and agricultural infrastructure is destroyed. The third horseman rides across these war-torn lands, ensuring that hunger follows in the wake of violence. In countries like Yemen, Syria, and South Sudan, where civil wars and political unrest have torn apart communities, millions of people are facing severe food insecurity. In many cases, it is not just a matter of crops failing but of the deliberate destruction of food sources as a tactic of war. The suffering that results is not only physical but psychological, as people are forced to live in constant fear of starvation and death. But famine also takes on a more subtle, long-term form. The slow decline of the environment, combined with the failure to address global inequality, creates a perfect storm for hunger. Deforestation, soil depletion, and overfarming all contribute to the gradual erosion of the Earth's ability to feed its population. In addition, the rise of global capitalism has created a system where food is treated as a commodity rather than a basic human right. This commodification of food has led to practices that prioritize profit over the needs of the most vulnerable. Corporations control the means of food production and distribution, while small-scale farmers in impoverished nations are left with little support or opportunity. The passage from Revelation also makes reference to the oil and wine being untouched, which may allude to the fact that even in times of famine, luxury goods and excess continue to flow. This symbolic disparity reflects the inequality that often exacerbates the effects of famine. While the poor suffer, the elite continue to indulge in their excesses, unaffected by the suffering around them. The focus on oil and wine suggests that the things considered non-essential are still preserved, while the essential elements of life, food, become scarce and unaffordable. While famine is often associated with the developing world, it is important to recognize that the potential for widespread hunger exists everywhere. In the modern world, food insecurity affects millions of people in even the wealthiest nations. In the United States, for example, food banks are inundated with people in need, and families in developed countries face the harsh reality of choosing between food and other basic necessities like healthcare and housing. This is a sobering reminder that famine, in its various forms, is not a distant threat but a pressing issue that affects people globally. The impact of famine goes beyond mere physical hunger. When people cannot access food, entire communities break down, social structures disintegrate, and individuals are left to fend for themselves in an environment that grows increasingly hostile. The psychological toll of famine is immense, as individuals experience feelings of helplessness, desperation, and hopelessness. These emotional scars, like the physical scars of hunger, can last long after the immediate crisis has passed. Famine is also linked to displacement. As people flee areas suffering from food shortages, they often become refugees, seeking shelter in other countries or regions. The refugee crisis, fueled in part by famine and food insecurity, adds further strain to global resources. As displaced populations move across borders in search of food and safety, they often face hostility and discrimination, making their survival even more difficult. The third horseman, the symbol of famine, is a powerful reminder of the fragility of food systems and the vulnerability of human life. It calls attention to the systemic issues that lead to hunger and the deep inequalities that persist in society. The black horse, with its rider carrying the scales, serves as a chilling reminder of the imbalance that exists between abundance and scarcity, and the devastating consequences of that imbalance. As the world faces an uncertain future, where climate change, political instability, and economic inequality continue to threaten food security, the warning of the third horseman becomes ever more relevant. To avoid the coming famine, we must address these root causes and strive for a more equitable and sustainable world, where food is a right for all, not a privilege for a few. The fourth horseman of the apocalypse, according to the book of Revelation, is the most terrifying and ultimate figure in the quartet, riding a pale horse, often described as pale green or ashen. This horseman is not just a harbinger of death, but the very embodiment of mortality itself. The pale horse is the color of decay, sickness, and death, signifying the end of life. The rider, known as Death, is accompanied by Hades, the realm of the dead, who follows behind him, symbolizing the fate that awaits all who succumb to mortality. As the final horseman, Death serves as the inevitable conclusion to the chaos and devastation wrought by the previous three horsemen: conquest, war, and famine. In Revelation 6 verses 7-8, it is written, "And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth." This passage paints a bleak picture of the global destruction wrought by this horseman. Death has dominion over a quarter of the earth, and his means of spreading destruction are as varied as they are horrifying, through war, famine, disease, and the wild beasts of the world. The rider's name, Death, is a reminder that no one can escape the end that is inevitable for all living things. The presence of death in the apocalypse underscores the fragility of life and the certainty of mortality. It is the reminder that, No matter how much we strive for power, wealth, or fame, our ultimate end is the same: death. This theme has resonated throughout human history, with cultures and religions across the world acknowledging the inevitability of death as an essential part of the human experience. Death is not something to be feared or avoided, but rather accepted as a natural, albeit sobering, reality of life. In the context of the Four Horsemen, death's appearance is not merely a natural occurrence, but a force of overwhelming power. He comes as a consequence of the havoc created by the previous three horsemen. The world, after being ravaged by conquest, war, and famine, is left in a state of despair and destruction. The resources of the planet are stretched beyond their limits, and the suffering is so great that death becomes the inevitable conclusion for many. The horseman of death does not discriminate. It takes all in its path, regardless of status, wealth, or power. It represents the final leveling force, bringing all people, rich and poor alike, to the same end. One of the most powerful symbols associated with the fourth horseman is his pale horse. Pale, or ashen, suggests not only death, but decay and corruption. It speaks to the degradation of life that occurs when civilization breaks down, when disease runs rampant, and when the natural order of things is disturbed. It is a visual reminder of the fragility of human existence and the irreversible impact of death on all things living. The pale horse, unlike the other horses that represent more immediate forces, such as war and famine, serves as the symbol of the eventual end that all will face. It is the most universal of the horsemen, affecting every person and every nation. The arrival of the fourth horseman also highlights the theme of divine judgment. While the first three horsemen represent the consequences of human choices, greed, violence, and exploitation, the arrival of death symbolizes the end of these cycles and the final reckoning. It is the culmination of all that came before, a reminder that no matter how powerful a civilization becomes, it is ultimately subject to the forces of nature, time, and mortality. The idea of divine judgment through death is not unique to Christianity, as many ancient cultures and religions have explored the concept of death as a final reckoning, where the souls of the deceased are judged for their actions in life. In modern times, the symbolism of the fourth horseman remains powerful and relevant. Death, as a concept, continues to evoke deep fear and fascination in people across the world. It serves as a reminder of the limitations of human power and the inevitable end that awaits all. In the context of the global crises that we face today, such as climate change, pandemics, and geopolitical instability, death may seem more imminent than ever. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, has reminded us of how quickly death can come, how vulnerable we are to forces beyond our control, and how fragile our systems of health and safety can be. The pandemic has made us confront our own mortality in ways that we may not have been prepared for. Just as the arrival of the fourth horseman brings the ultimate truth, that death is a force that no one can outrun. The threat of pandemics and the rise of new, deadly diseases also echo the imagery of the fourth horseman. Death in the modern era is no longer just a consequence of old age or violent conflict, but also a result of emerging pathogens and the collapse of healthcare systems. In our interconnected world, diseases spread more rapidly than ever before, and the consequences can be catastrophic. The appearance of death as a result of disease, as well as the other means of destruction listed in the passage, sword, hunger, and wild beasts, serves as a warning that the world is increasingly vulnerable to multiple forms of devastation. Global health systems, strained by constant challenges, are ill-prepared for the next wave of deadly diseases that could emerge. The fourth horseman is not just a figure of physical death, but also a symbol of the psychological and emotional death that accompanies large-scale destruction. When people are faced with prolonged suffering, loss, and despair, they experience a form of existential death, the loss of hope, the erosion of meaning in life, and the sense of being overwhelmed by the forces beyond our control can be as devastating as physical death. As nations are torn apart by conflict and disaster, as communities are ravaged by disease and poverty, the psychological toll is immense. People lose their sense of purpose, their connection to others, and their will to survive. In this sense, the fourth horseman is not just a killer of the body, but a killer of the spirit. Moreover, the concept of Hades, following death, adds another layer of meaning to the fourth horseman. Hades is the realm of the dead in Greek mythology, and in the context of the apocalypse, it represents the afterlife or the end of human existence. Hades' following of death suggests that death is not the final end but leads to something beyond, an uncertain, shadowy existence after life. In a sense, death brings about not only the physical end but also a spiritual reckoning. The fear of what comes after death, the unknown, can be as powerful a force as the death itself. In modern times, the question of what happens after death continues to fascinate and terrify people. It is a reminder that death, while inevitable, does not offer answers to all the mysteries of life. The fourth horseman, with his pale horse and his dominion over death and the afterlife, serves as the final reckoning in the apocalypse. He is the embodiment of the end of all things, a reminder that no matter how far humanity advances, there will always be forces beyond our control that can bring everything to an end. In a world where technological advancements promise to prolong life and give us dominion over nature, death serves as the ultimate reminder that mortality is a part of the human condition that no one can escape. The fourth horseman reminds us of the limits of human power and the inevitability of our eventual demise, urging us to confront our mortality and live meaningfully in the time we have.